Hey friends, welcome to Flight Test Tech. I'm Josh. Today we're going to be showing you how to build a new FT Mini Old Fogey. What we've done is we've taken the classic lines of the full-size Old Fogey and we've shrunk that down to a mini size that is under 250 grams with a wingspan of only about 25 inches. That means you don't have to worry about flying those with any regulations that may come in the future. Let's go ahead and get our materials in order and we'll get started. So the first thing we're going to start with our construction of the Mini Old Fogey is going to be our wings. The main pieces we're going to need for our wing are going to be our outer wing tips, our center wing section, our under camber gauge, and also our dihedral gauge. It's also a really good idea to have a barbecue skewer included in our kit handy so we can make our channel bigger so this will fold over easier. Once we have all of our pieces, we're going to take the very tip of our barbecue skewer and we're going to put a light crush about halfway down right on our wing pieces. We don't want to go all the way to the paper, we just want to make enough so it can easily bend up without fighting us too much. With the leading edge easy to raise up from the table, we're going to take our little dihedral gauges and we're going to just do a practice fit. We're going to take each dihedral gauge and we're going to push it in until the very back of the gauge lines up with the leading edge of the wing. Make sure that you don't have any pressure that's pushing down or fighting against you. If you do, open this channel up just a little bit more. Now that we've done our test fit, we can open this up. We're going to take our hot glue gun and we're going to put a nice bead of glue right in the middle. Again, right back down to the table. If you have any excess hot glue squeezing out, it's really easy to take a scrap piece of foam and wipe off the excess. We're going to give this a good couple minutes to fully dry to make sure that we fully have that under camber before moving on to the outer wing tips. I always like to hold my hands flat up against the bottom surface of the wing, pressing it against the table to make sure that this form doesn't move. Once this is fully dry, you'll notice that we can pull out these little gauges and the leading edge shouldn't drop at all. Let's go ahead and do the same process now on the other two pieces. And just like before, we're going to raise this up, do a practice fit. That looks great. Now we can open it up. Bead of glue right in the crack. Right back down on the table. And if needed, of course, we can take a little scrap piece of foam, wipe off any excess. And one more panel. Again with a practice fold. That looks great. Always like to start and stop my bead of glue just about a 1/4 inch from the edge just to make sure it doesn't leak out and cause too much ugliness. There we go. So now you can see that all three of our pieces line up just perfectly. I'm just going to go ahead and do a quick test fit and make sure we're happy with that. That looks great. Our next step here is we're going to take a scrap piece of tape. I'm going to shingle this right over top on both sides of the wing. I'm going to very carefully put a piece of tape on both sides. This tape is just going to be temporary, but it basically gives us the ability to make a nice hinge door like you see here. Now that we have that, we can use our dihedral gauge and establish the proper amount of dihedral. When we place our dihedral gauge on here, we want to make sure that we put it right at the point of that bend of the wing that gives us the under camber. Once we're happy with the way everything fits, we can just open this up like a door and put a nice healthy bead of glue right on the middle section here. Right back down on the table. And I'm just going to focus on holding the wing down right at the leading edge and the trailing edge right by where the wing is. Give this a couple minutes to fully dry and we'll do the same process on the other side. Now that we've given this a couple minutes to dry, you'll know it's fully dried if we can pull out the dihedral gauge and nothing moves. Let's go and do the same exact process on the other side. I'm even going to go ahead and reuse my little piece of tape here. When you're doing the other side, it's easiest to let the other side of the wing hang over the table so that way we're not putting any extra pressure on it. And just like before, we're going to shingle the outer wing panel over the middle section and then press it down with a piece of tape on each end. If at any point you realize that you didn't put quite enough glue on here, you can always go back and reapply, use a scrap piece of foam and smear off the excess. All right, we have that hinged on both sides. Just do a quick test fit. There we go. Make sure our dihedral gauge fits nice and neat, and it does. Now we can open this up. Oops. Right down to the table. and press it in place. I'm just going to use my old under camber gauge here as a squeegee. Got a little excessive on my glue, no big deal, just wipe it in. Alright, we've let this dry a couple minutes. Our wing's now nice and dry. And I'm just going to pull off this excess tape. And our wing is now done. Again, if any of these areas seem a little bit weak, you can always put a thin bead of glue in, come back with a scrap piece of foam, and smear it in there. But at this point, we can put this aside and we can put our attention towards the fuselage. So to prepare for building our main fuselage of our mini old Fogey, we're going to need the following foam pieces. We're going to need our main fuselage piece, our rear turtle deck, our rudder, our elevator, and also our push rod guides. Now the really unique thing about this build is we're also going to be installing our servos at this point. So let's go ahead and make sure that we have both of our mini servos centered and with the very smallest control horns installed possible. One thing that's critical with this design is you do not want too much throw on both the rudder and the elevator. If you have too much throw, that's going to cause it to be very, very squirrely and not be easy to fly. So for that reason, we already pre-selected our 2 servo arms. We're going to trim 3 of the arms off, leaving only 1 piece. Now you're going to notice that this servo arm has a hole as close as possible to the center servo screw. This is going to give us the minimal throw, but really good resolution, which means your controls are going to move very, very smoothly. To center our servos, if you have our crafty kit, you have everything you need already. It comes with this little servo centering tool. We're going to take the existing ESC that we're going to be using from our Power Pack A. We're going to plug this in right where it says in. We're going to line the signal, which is the S, with our orange or white wire and plug it in like you see here. Now on the other side, we can go horizontally. We can plug both of our servos in, making sure that we line up our signal and our ground. You can plug up to 3 servos at a time to do your centering or your testing. Now I'm just simply going to go ahead and take my battery here. I'm going to plug that into my ESC, and you're going to see that we have 3 modes. When we press the button to the middle one, that's going to be our neutral position. The other functions are auto cycle, and we can even change the rate. And finally, our manual position lets us turn the servo one direction or the other. So we're going to go ahead and put our lights right in the middle. I'm going to take my hobby knife here. I'm going to try off the 3 wings. There's 1. There's 2. There's 3. Now I can hold both of my servos in position here. I'm going to install 1 servo arm facing one direction, making sure that it's 90 degrees from my servo, and the second servo arm is going to face the other direction. You can now see that if I cycle through here, there's our automatic, here's our manual, and there's our centered. Our final step to do in our centering our servos is to lock this down with our servo screw. Now in our little bags of servo screws, you're going to see a very, very short, tiny screw. This is going to be the screw that we want to use. We don't want to use our servo hold down screws, which are going to be a little bit longer. If you use the longer one, it's going to damage your screw. Make sure you use the very short one with the fat little head on it. Just going to unplug this here. We can test it right before we put it down again. Make sure whenever you're putting your servo screw in, hold the arm so it doesn't put any of the stress on the gears. Beautiful thing about this design is it's only 2 channels, so once you have these 2 servos done, you're basically done with the part that nobody likes. And just one last little test here. We'll plug this in, turn it to neutral, manual, neutral. We're all set and ready to move on to installing these. Now that we've centered our servos, we can put our attention back towards the fuselage. So to prepare our fuselage, we're going to first put our rudder and our elevator to the side. We're going to focus mainly on the center section. The first thing we want to do is we want to take our hobby knife and we want to cut down through our score lines, not all the way through the facing paper on the other side, just enough to make this easy to weed out. A really easy tip is to simply dull the very tip of your blade, and that will give you the ability to cut down close to the facing paper without cutting through it. There we go. And we're going to go along with all of our score lines here. The better you clear out the channels for where your score lines are, the better your model's going to go together. And we might as well do this one while we're at it too. Now we can simply just rotate this over and pop it out. The adhesion on our new maker foam is very good, so if at any point the foam sticks to the paper, you don't have to worry about that. You can easily scrape it off with a razor blade. And while we're at it, we're also going to remove the rear facing paper of our back turtle deck. Feel free to pause the video at this moment, make sure that your piece looks exactly like mine does, and then we're going to move on by joining the center section here. It's always handy to have a little scrap piece of foam by you. The first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to join this main piece here. First thing we want to do is place a bead of glue right down the middle here so we can join our bottom surface nice and flat. Make sure this fully dries before moving on to our next step. Also, if you have any excess, you can always squeegee off the excess with a piece of scrap foam. Now that our center section is glued together, we can do our C-fold on the very front. To do our C-fold, first we're going to place a bead of glue right on the top surface and a very thin bead of glue on the paper. We can now fold this over 180 degrees, wiggle it back and forth, spreading the glue out nice and thin, and then we're going to hold it down into place. If you have any excess squeeze out on either side, just take a piece of scrap foam and wipe it off. Now that we have our C-folds done, you're going to notice that we have a very light etch mark on the back of our fuselage. This is going to be where we're going to carefully allow a crease to happen by lifting up very gently. And now comes the fun part. We're going to take our 2 push rod reinforcement blocks, and I'm just going to take the tip of my push rod and I'm going to push this down through. We want this to be able to easily glide through just like this without binding. Now that we have our push rod guide through our piece of foam, we're going to take note of where our Z-bend is. The Z-bend is going to remain inside the fuselage, and we're going to take the rear of the push rod and we're going to guide that through the cut in the rear part of the fuselage going towards our elevator or our rudder. Once we have this down in place, we're going to put a thin bead of glue on both sides of our push rod guide foam. We're going to line it up right over our edge cut and we're going to press it down into place. We're going to do this exact same process now on the other side. We're going to simply open this up, making sure that it doesn't bind at all. Our Z-bend is going to go towards the nose. The rear of our push rod is going to go right through the rear slot. And then we're going to press this down into place. Bead of glue, bead of glue. You should notice that both of our push rods still glide nice and free. Our next step is to glue in our push rods. To do this to get the best glue joint possible, I'm going to remove the sticker of our little servos. I can make sure that the surface is nice and clean. Use an alcohol wipe if you have to, it's kind of oily. And I'm also going to scratch it up. With a razor blade. These scratches done through either a razor blade or really aggressive sandpaper are going to give it the ability to be able to stick well to the foam. Our push rod's going to come up through the bottom, so I'm going to start from the bottom through my servo arm, and I press it up into place just like this. Now it's really important that we make sure that we give at least one width of foam thickness between the bottom of the servo and also the bottom of the fuselage. And that's going to be because when we do our B-fold, we don't want the servo to be too low. So make sure that the bottom of your servo is the same height up as our push rod guide foam. To get as much weight forward as possible, I like to place the leading edge of the servo just behind our C-fold here. Once we're happy with that, we're going to place a bead of glue here. I'm going to flip this over. And I'm going to press this down into place. So you have a little bit of excess glue, not a problem. I'm just going to take my squeegee and squeegee it off. Make sure that you don't move your servo while this is gluing, because if this comes loose, you're not going to have any control in flight. And we're going to do the exact same process now on the other side. Don't need to remove the sticker on this one because it's going to be the surface that doesn't have a sticker. Just going to scratch it up very carefully. Put the servo in from the bottom. Little bead of glue, and then we'll press it down. Again, I'm going to be making sure there's at least one thickness of foam between the bottom of the servo and our channel. Now it's very important that both of our servos stayed centered. I'm just going to bring back my servo centering tool real quick. We'll plug it in. There's one. There's two. We'll plug in our battery. And we're centered. Everything looks really good. Now that our servos are centered, we can now fold up the sides of our fuselage. To do this, we're going to make sure we have the proper amount of To do this, we're going to make sure that the back of our fuselage bends in nice so it matches up perfectly with the very bottom of our fuselage. If this needs to be bent and held in, just give a little bit more pressure up so you don't have to fight it as you rotate it up. It's also a really good idea to make sure this gets exactly 90 degrees, and to do that we can use our Crafty Kit triangle squares. Alright, so we'll do one more test fit, make sure we're happy with the way it looks. Now for our fuselage sides, we're going to be doing a B-fold. A B-fold is where the side plates are beside the bottom plate. When we do a B-fold, we're going to leave the bottom plate firmly against the table, and we're going to rotate the side plate up next to the bottom plate. An A-fold and B-fold is indicated by the symbol that's been etched into your foam on the piece. I'm just going to go ahead and hold the servo lead out of the way. Got plenty of glue in my hot glue gun. I'm going to focus the majority of the glue on the side of the bottom plate. There we go, all the way to the back. I'm going to rotate this up 90 degrees. And what I'm doing is I'm putting my attention, making sure that the back of the fuselage is pressed up firmly against the back of the bottom plate. Now I can come in with my triangle square, and I can hold that with my finger, and that's going to make sure everything dries nice and perpendicular to the table. We're going to give this a good minute to dry, and then repeat the process on the other side. We've done one side, let's go and do the other side. Making sure this angle is good. Bend it up 90 degrees, everything looks fantastic. It's always really important to make sure you have a nice tight seam right against the bottom of the table. This is going to assure that you have a proper B-fold. And that looks fantastic. Now I'm going to be focusing all my glue right on the side of the bottom plate. And I like to stop about a 1/4 inch from the edge. And I'll just put a little bit on this doubler too. Keep my servo out of the way here. Rotate it up 90 degrees. It's really important that you don't ever try to rush anything when you're building these models. You're going to find that smooth is fast. Take your time, always test fit your pieces. Make sure it's perpendicular. And then we'll hold it in place. Now we can carefully kind of tuck the two servo leads down into place. Let's go ahead and finish off the front of our fuselage. First thing I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be doing my nose. We'll do a quick practice test. And I also like to do, whenever I do my nose, I like to take it right to the edge of the table, land in the back of the canopy overhang. That looks great. Alright, just like before, bead of glue on both sides of the top or bottom plate. In this case, it's the top plate. We're going to fold this over, take it right down to the table, and use the table as our friend to hold it into place. Never hurts to go back and make sure that you're holding everything perpendicular. And that looks great. And one final seam here. Again, we're going to do a quick test fit. That looks great. It's always a good idea to clean off your working surface. Oftentimes, whatever you push it up against is going to mark it. Press that right into place here. Right down on the table. And we'll hold it until it dries. Now that we have our main portion of our fuselage done, we're going to teach you a brand new technique here. And this is something that John Overstreet does with a lot of his Master Series. But it's also something that we can do to make this turtle deck have a nice reverse bend without wrinkling. For this, we're going to use a simple can of spray paint. It can be empty or full. And we're going to take our back turtle deck here that already has the paper peeled from the back side. What we want to do is we want to match up this reverse bend. We're going to lay this can right over top of the paper, making sure that the peeled side is facing down. From that point, we can press down nice and even, and we can simply roll it back. You're going to notice as we do this, that the piece is naturally going to start curling up as we compress the foam down. I like to get the first part right by where the fuselage is going to be, and then work my way towards the back because it has less of a crease. I'll do a little bit more. There we go. And once we get it pretty close, we can very carefully slide this into position and see how it looks. And that looks wonderful. It's also very handy to keep a scrap piece of foam by you, just so we can press this down without burning our hands. Once we're happy with the fit, which we are in this case, let's go ahead and put a bead of glue on both sides. I have an extra hot glue stick right here for when I run out. I'll put a nice healthy bead down one side and a second healthy bead on the other. And since we've already practiced our fold, I'm just going to slide this right down into position. Forgive my shaky hands. And we can't really use a table as our friend, so that's where that foam is going to be really handy for us. So hold in the position. There we go. And I just like to gently tap in wherever we need to make sure it stays down. Notice that I'm not just pressing down on the piece, but I'm also pressing inward on the fuselage here to get our seam as clean and as tight as possible. At this point, we're going to put our attention towards both the elevator and the rudder. Now you're going to notice here as I lay this out, making sure that the hinge line is facing down, that the elevator push rod is on my right side, and the rudder push rod is going to be on my left side. The reason why this is important is because before we install these or do any kind of bevel cuts, we're going to go ahead and pre-bend both of our push rods. Now for this step, it's also very important that we don't accidentally move our servo arms back and forth. That's why I've always kept our servo centering tool handy. So for this step, one more time, I'm going to go ahead and plug in my servo centering tool. The better we do these steps now and the more centered we keep our servos, the less adjustment we have later. And I'm going to make sure that it's on neutral. There we go. Perfect. Now this is somewhat of a unique step here because typically we're bending our push rods to match up directly with our hinge line, but the really cool thing about this is our hinge line is the very back of our fuselage. That means we can pre-bend both of our Z-bends to get them perfectly right without having both our tail and our elevator in the way. The one thing we want to make sure that we do though is that we bend this up properly. In other words, we want to make sure that we don't bend our rudder horizontally and our elevator vertically. We want to actually do our rudder vertically and our elevator horizontally so it passes through the control horn. So to do this, I'm first going to do the elevator. All I need to do is I simply need to push this right up against the back of the fuselage. I'm going to grab the elevator push rod vertically, and I'm going to support this, and I'm going to bend this straight out. Just like that. Now that I've done that, I can grip it about 2 millimeters in, and I'm going to bend the remaining 90 degrees vertical. This is going to make our modified Z-bend. Now I can cut this about 4 millimeters out. There we go. And finally, I can carefully rotate this 90 degrees to make a full Z-bend. There we go. There's one, and you're going to see that that's going to line up perfectly with the hinge line of our elevator. Now let's go ahead and do our rudder. The rudder is going to be bent vertically, so I'm going to push this right up against the back of our fuselage. I'm going to grip this right. Once I have this pushed up at the back of the fuselage, I'm going to grip the push rod. Notice I'm holding my pliers horizontally this time, and I'm going to rotate that vertically. Next, I'm going to grip about 2 millimeters in, and I'm going to rotate that horizontally. And finally, I'm going to cut off the excess. And to make life just a little bit easier, I'm going to bend it 90 degrees. Now when we glue both our elevator and our rudder in, these are going to be exactly where the hinge line needs to be, which is going to make it perfect. We do have a couple millimeters of adjustment we can do with our control horn without compromising too much of our deflection being equal. This is a really easy way to get your push rod adjustments perfect without having to use any linkage stoppers. To prep the opening for our rudder, we're just going to simply take either a straight edge, I'm going to use my square guide here, I'm going to line it up here, and I'm going to finish off the cut. Do this in a couple slices just to get a nice clean edge. There's one. And there's two. Let's pop this out. Before we install our rudder, we're going to want to establish our bevel cut. To do our bevel cut, we're going to open this up 180 degrees, and on the same side as our rudder, we're going to cut a single bevel. An easy way to cut a single bevel, especially if you have a crafty kit using our hobby knife, is to close up your knife 1d10 in, and this gives you the perfect posture that you need to cut a nice smooth cut. We're going to take our We're gonna take our knife just above the facing paper on the bottom, and with a smooth pull, we'll have a perfect cut every time. Now don't worry if you have to go back a couple times. The important thing is when you cut your bevel, that the bevel ends as close as possible to the facing paper and that you don't have any resistance going back and forth. Now to reinforce our bevel, we're gonna do what we call a hot glue reinforcement hinge. To do this, we're gonna put a very thin bead of glue right where the paper meets the foam. Then we're just gonna take a scrap piece of foam and we're gonna smear off any excess that we have. It's important that we remove all the extra glue because if we leave any glue globs right on the hinge line, it's gonna bind it up. Also, make sure that you let this fully dry. One trick I do is I lick the tip of my finger and I drag it over the glue. That takes away any tackiness that you may have and keeps it from gluing together. And now we're gonna go ahead and do our test fit. Line this in. There we go. And that should go all the way to the bottom here. Once we're happy with our test fit, we can come back with a bead of glue. Once we're happy with our test fit, we'll come back with a bead of glue, put on the very bottom of the rudder on both sides of the skid. Don't worry if your skid gets beat up a little bit. This will be mostly covered by the elevator. Go right down again, right into that slot. Press it right down in there. There we go. As we sight down it, we want to make sure that the rudder is vertical to the fuselage and it looks perfect. Now we're going to do the same process on our elevator here. We'll just open up this little channel. That's where our skid's going to push through. And we can open up the bottom of our elevator. The bevel cut for our elevator is going to be on the elevator side. We already have our knife kind of preset for the angle. And for this, especially since it's a closed angle, I like to use a little bit of a saw motion. And that gives me the ability, as I rotate this more and more to 90, to be able to cut nice and clean. And we'll just come back on this side now. A little bit of a saw motion. We don't try to push the blade through, we let the blade naturally glide through it. Again, we're gonna check our deflection. It moves easily back and forth. I'm gonna put a bead of glue right where the paper and the foam meet. Then I'm gonna come back immediately with a scrap piece of foam and wipe off any excess. And again, as a simple little trick, you can lick the tip of your finger, wipe it right over that glue joint, and it'll dry it quickly and keep it from being tacky. Now that we have our bevel cut, we're gonna make sure that the bevel is facing downwards. We're gonna do a quick test fit here, making sure that the hinge line lines right up with the back of the tail, which it does. And that looks perfect. The most important thing whenever we're test fitting is to make sure that there's no gap between the seams of the bottom of your fuselage. If you do this, everything should be perfectly perpendicular. I'm just gonna take my nail here, I'm just gonna mark it right where the elevator ends, and that's gonna give me a good indication of where I need to put my hot glue. Bead of glue on this side, and a bead of glue on that side. Again, making sure that the bevel edge is down. Slide this in. Little rock back and forth. And I'm just gonna press it in place, and I'm just gonna sight down the fuselage to make sure it's perpendicular to the tail and the sides of the fuselage. That looks fantastic. Included in our kit are 2 mini control horns. We're gonna go ahead and install those right now. Our first mini control horn is gonna go into our elevator. We're gonna go ahead and slide this in first. Little rotation's all we need. And press that right into the slot. Now, providing that you didn't move your servo arm at all, you're going to notice that our hole is exactly over the hinge line and that everything is perfectly neutral. Now, to get the proper angle of attack and slow flight that we want, we're going to go ahead and bend up the elevator just 1 millimeter of deflection for the top surface above the stabilizer. Once we're happy with that test fit, we can pop this loose. Put a bead of glue right down, right over that slot, and then press it down into place again. Again, we're going to go back, make sure we have just about 1 millimeter deflection right on the back surface here. and that's going to give us the angle of attack that we want. And we'll be doing the same process that we just did on the rudder here. A little bit of twist. Press it right into the slot. We can use our triangle gauge to make sure everything is perfectly neutral, no deflection on this one like we did on the elevator. And once we're happy with it, a bead of glue is all we need to lock that down. Anytime you're gluing any control surfaces, whether it's your servos, whether it's your control horns, always make sure you give plenty of time for the glue to fully dry before moving on. If any of these joints fail in flight, you're going to lose control of that surface. Alright friends, at this point the main fuselage section of our mini old Fogey is now done. We're going to go and put this aside now, and we're going to put our attention towards the power pod and the electronics. The pieces that we're going to need for our power pod are going to be our main power pod foam piece, our mini firewall, our ESC, and also our motor. Keep in mind that the assembly and the process is the exact same no matter what the motor looks like. Just like our fuselage that we did earlier, we're going to go down our score cuts, and we're going to cut close to the facing paper, and we're going to open up the channels for our A-fold. Now for an A-fold, our side plates are going to be above the bottom plate. To do a proper A-fold, we're going to leave the side plates firmly against the table, and we're going to rotate up the bottom plate next to it. We're going to focus the glue mainly on the bottom of the side plate, starting and stopping about 1/4 inch from the edge. Again, we're going to leave the side plate firmly against the table. We're going to rotate the bottom plate, pressing down against the table up 90 degrees. Same process on the other side. Do a quick test fit. That looks great. And now we can place our glue right on the bottom. Again, back down to the table with the side plate, up 90 degrees, and we'll use the triangle to make sure it's perpendicular. I always like to sing "You Are My Sunshine" in my head. That'll give you plenty of time to allow the glue to dry before moving on. Now that we have our power pod done, you're going to notice that we have a hole on the bottom. This is going to be for our wire to be able to go through to connect to the battery. This lower left-hand corner is also going to be the way that we're going to orientate our firewall so the wires can push through just like you see here. So we have the hole in our firewall for our motor wires, and we have the hole for our ESC. Once we have that orientation established, we're going to place a bead of glue right around here. We're going to place a bead of glue right on the edge of the power pod. Then we're going to lay our power pod in place. It's really important that the bottom surface of the power pod is flush with the bottom. It's incredibly important to make sure that we don't just move on to the next step and install our motors. What we want to do now is we want to wrap this power pod with tape. The tape is going to be what gives us the strength to keep the firewall and the power pod from separating in the form of a crash or a tip over. I'm going to tear off about 8 to 10 inches of tape here. I'm just using simple 2-inch packing tape. We're going to wrap completely around. And I can fold over the edges just like I'm wrapping a gift. To give this a little bit extra strength, I'm going to do one additional piece of tape from the bottom to the front of the firewall. There we go. Same process. Just fold in the edges. Once we have this wrapped, we can take our razor blade and we can cut open the openings for the center of our motor, our mounting screws. It's really important that we make sure that the center hole for the motor is cleared out. If this is dragging up against the motor, it's going to cause your motor to bind and overheat. Let's go ahead and prepare our motor here. Now if you're building along using a different motor like maybe our Emax 1806 or the original FT Radial 1806 motor, you're going to have a different selection of motor screws. It's very important that you don't use too long of motor screws when screwing in your motor. If you use too long of screws, it's going to hit the windings and destroy your motor. So I always pick the shortest screws in the pack. Now our version 2 1806 only gives you one selection of screws, so you know that you're not going to accidentally strip it out. And now I can pass my motor leads through the little square hole, one at a time. Without putting too much pressure on here, I'm going to leave a little bit of slack. And we're only going to use 2 of the 4 holes. The holes that we're going to use are going to be the wider 2. So you can see as we line this up here, I'm just simply going to line up one hole. I'm going to start the threads. I'm not going to tighten it down. Now I can grab the secondary hole. And we're going to tighten it down. You can use Loctite if you wish. The only thing, if you do use Loctite, make sure you use the blue and not the red. After we have our motor installed, we're going to install our ESC. Now, it doesn't really matter which order we plug this in, because if our motor runs backwards at any point, we can easily reverse it by swapping any 2 of the 3 leads. There we go. And then finally, I'm just going to take my battery lead and I'm going to press it right through the little hole that we have in the bottom of our power pod. One thing that we can do here just to make sure that our motor is spinning the right direction before we install it into the fuselage is simply by plugging this in. I'm going to go and plug this in the same way, making sure that my signal wire lines up with my S, my minus is lined up with my ground, and I'm not going to be plugging battery voltage in here. I'm going to be plugging that into my ESC here. So we'll go ahead and plug this in. I'm also going to make sure I turn this all the way down. There we go. Now when I rotate this, we're going to see that it's actually spinning clockwise. We want it to spin counterclockwise. So we want this to spin counterclockwise. So to do so, I'm going to go ahead and unplug 2 of these leads and swap them. There's 1 and there's 2. A little quick tip is to make sure that you never allow the brass leads to touch each other. In other words, make sure your connectors are fully seated together and that there's no exposed brass. If they touch each other, it's going to short out and damage your motor and your ESC. All right, one more test here. And that's now spinning counterclockwise, which is the direction we want. At this point, our power pod is now done. Now, one important thing, we're not going to put the propeller on until we're ready to take this out in the fly. That way, if we're hooking up anything on the bench and we accidentally bump the throttle, we're not going to put ourselves or others in danger. Let's go ahead and move on to our next step, and that's going to be installing our power pod and hooking up our receiver to the airplane. Before we do our final electronics and finish off the airplane, we're going to install our landing gear. But the first thing we need to do is we need to bend it. For this, we're going to need our 18-inch ruler. If you have the Crafty kit, we already have one handy. And you're going to need your thin landing gear. Now, our landing gear measures 15.5 inches long. We're going to bend it exactly in half, and to do that, we're going to go right to the 7 3/4 inch mark. I always like bending a little bit sharper than I need to. It's going to be about maybe a 30-degree angle. And the reason is I want this to be wide enough so you can go about 2 inches back and meet both sides of the fuselage. Speaking of 2 inches back, that's going to be our next bend. So right here, we're going to go ahead and we're going to go to 2 inches. I'm just going to mark it with my nail. I'm going to grip it. I'm going to bend it just out slightly from perpendicular. We'll go 2 inches on the other side. And I always like to kind of grip this so as I bend it, I'm bending it out slightly. We don't ever have to worry about getting this exactly perfect because we're going to use the table as our friend. In order to do this, all I need to do is pick the side that I prefer. In this case, it's going to be, looks like my right-hand side. I'm going to bend this up and you're going to notice that this is higher. We're just going to go ahead and bend that down ever so slightly. And before we move on to the next step, we're going to want to make sure that both legs of the landing gear are flush with the table. At any point that you see that they're not bending evenly out, we can easily open these up just evenly. We can easily open these up, and then we go right back to making sure that they match each other in angle. Once we're happy with the way this looks, we're going to go from the point of our last bend down 3 1/4 inches. You can always use a marker or your thumbnail, doesn't matter. And this is going to be the point where we bend our wheel axles. There's one side. And then once we do our first side, we're going to confirm that we're 1 1/4 inches. In this case, we are. If accidentally we bend it a little bit too long or a little too short, just make sure that you match that measurement that you just took and not the one that you originally bent. So in this case, it's still 3 1/4 inches. We'll mark it right there. And we're going to bend it again. Now we're back down to the table again. We're just going to bend this so it lays flat against the table. Now we can install our wheels using globs of glue, but if you want to make sure that these never come off, we do have wheel collars now available in our store. I'm going to go ahead and install the wheels with those wheel collars. The landing gear specifically for the mini old Fogey is very important. It gives us a lot of stability. And also the needed nose weight that we need to make the plane balance properly. So don't skip out on this step. Once we have the one side done, we can cut it off. And the same process on the other side. Our landing gear is now done. Let's go ahead and install it on our fuselage. The easiest way to install our landing gear on the fuselage is by taking it right to the edge here. And the point that's going to exit is going to be right where the fold over from our C-fold meets on the bottom of the fuselage. Also, if you bent this evenly, you should notice that the very tip of the landing gear goes right down our center line. Once I'm happy with the placement, I'm simply going to press this in, and it's going to make a nice indented mark right where I need to cut. Now I can come back and I can cut right over that indented mark down through one layer of foam. Make sure that you only go through one layer of foam. The second layer is for strength. Before we press our landing gear in, use either a piece of landing gear wire or the tip of your 1.5mm hex screwdriver to open up the channel and do a quick test fit to make sure that your landing gear will press into place without too much difficulty. I always like to start on one side, press it down in, and then press in the other side. You can even use a barbecue skewer to get it all the way down into place. Do a quick test fit. Make sure that looks good. Make sure our landing gear spread is nice and even. Now we're going to make sure that we have a piece of scrap foam handy. I'm going to put a nice healthy bead of glue right over top of the landing gear and press that hot glue into place. There's one, and there's two. While that glue is drying, we can put our attention towards our rear skid. We're just going to take our included barbecue skewer. We're going to take the pointy end, and with a rotating twist, we're going to press that pointy end to the back of our fuselage, and we're going to trim off the excess about a ½ inch extra. There we go. Put a small bead of glue right on that skid, and we'll press it down into place. If you have any extra glue, you can simply just wipe that off. Now that we have our landing gear and our skid down, we can move on to our next step, which is installing our power pod and hooking up our receiver. Now for this application, you can use any transmitter you want. The important thing is make sure you have your transmitter and your receiver already bound and ready to be installed. For this application, I'm going to be using the Zorro and the R88 receiver. Now installing the receiver here, specifically with the R88, we're going to be installing our throttle into servo port number 3. If you're doing a Spectrum, it's going to be servo port number 1. It's really important whether you're using Spectrum or Radio Master to make sure your signal wire lines up with the signal pin in your receiver. If it's backwards, it's simply not going to work. We got our receiver in here. Next I'm going to track down my rudder here. And for a 3-channel radio, it's really important that we don't install the rudder into the rudder port. We're actually going to install our rudder into the aileron port because that stick is going to be giving us our turn control or our bank and our yaw. So in this case, we're going to install that into number 1. If you're doing Spectrum, that'll be into servo port number 2. And then finally, we're going to install our elevator into servo port number 2. On Spectrum, it's going to be servo port number 3. Let's go ahead and plug this in. We'll make sure everything works. We always want to turn on our transmitter first. Of course, we always make sure that we do not have our props on. All right, so what we want to make sure now is that we have everything. We have our throttle, which we do. We have our elevator, and we have our rudder. Now that everything's working the right direction, there's one last thing that I want to make sure that we address, and that's the amount of servo throw. Different radios will give you a different travel out of stock tune. Specifically, Radio Master, FR Sky, and a lot of other ones work at 125% of what Spectrum is. Because of this, we may notice that our throw is a lot more extreme than what we want. We want to dial this down to roughly 12 degrees of deflection. I'm going to just include a servo deflection gauge in my kit, okay? Included in the kit is going to be a deflection gauge for high rates and low rates. Make sure that you use this when setting up your transmitter and adjust your travel adjustment to line up with the throws. This is going to give you incredibly smooth flight characteristics and also make it very stable. Now that we have all of our servo directions and our throws established, we can go ahead and install our receiver and our ESC. I'm going to put both our receiver and our ESC up in our front power pod. This is going to help me with center of gravity, and then we can roll this right on in. There we go. I'll press this all the way back. And once I've slid my power pod all the way back where the firewall meets up against the top plate, and I've also pinched this to make sure it lines up with the top plate, I should be able to pass this through and it should guide right through the holes and out the other side. There's one. I'm just going to cut this nice and close here, leaving about 1/8 of an inch. And we'll do one more. Again, we're pressing this all the way up against it. There's one side. Going to go through the other side. And then I can pass it on through. There we go. Now that we have all of our electronics in, we're ready to go on to our next step, which is going to be installing our wing. Now for this, you can rubber band your wing on if you want to, using the extra barbecue skewer material you have and some rubber bands that you provide, but I prefer actually gluing my wing on. You're going to notice on the very bottom of our wings, we have these etch marks. These etch marks are going to help us center our wings properly and give us also our center of gravity right here. These etch marks are going to help us center our wings, and you're going to also notice that we have 2 markings here that are our center of gravity for balancing everything out. So let's go ahead and do a quick practice test here. I'm going to flip this upside down. I'm going to line out the etch marks, and that's going to make sure that everything is perpendicular and square. I'm going to take my hot glue gun. I'm not going to go on both sides. I'm just going to go on the 4 corners and right on the top. That way, if ever, God forbid, I do want to remove this wing, maybe it's to do a repair, all I simply need to do is take my razor blade and cut those areas. Again, I'm going to line this up here, try to do it so it's easy to see on the camera, right over top of those etch lines. There we go. The other side's done. And once I have that in place, I'm going to press down firmly. I'm going to hold it there for at least 2 minutes. I'm holding this down, I'm just tightening all around, making sure nothing's moving. We're going to let this fully dry. Included in our small pack is going to be some Velcro. I'm going to cut a piece of that Velcro just a little bit longer than the battery here, and that's going to give us the ability to be able to move that back and forward based on the battery we have. Now I already have prickly on the battery, so I'm going to go fuzzy fuselage. It's fun to say and easy to remember. That Velcro is simply going to mount on the very bottom of our power pod, and I'm going to sit it about 1/2 of an inch back from our firewall. And finally, we are going to install a propeller. At this point, our airframe is now done. You guys have a lot of options. Including our kit, we give you a window decal, but we also sell optional decals to make this look absolutely amazing. And we'll see you out in the flying field for its first flight. It's still flying. Friends, I want to thank you for being part of the Flight Test family. Thank you so much for taking the time to build with me, fly with me. We love the mini old Fogey. I think you will too. Look forward to seeing more of these in the air. We'll see you next time.